Yes, this is Benoit from Solidarité Progrès in Paris, and this is a question for Lynn. Yeah, okay. So we've been working quite closely in Paris on the SDE developments, and I was in contact with somebody with the European Space Agency, who's been very much involved in the setting up of the different committees, advisory committees at the United Nations for coordinating the work on space defense against near-Earth objects. And so there'll be different committees that will be set up basically this year. One which will coordinate all the work on the observation and tracking and calculating the orbits of asteroids, putting together the system at NASA, the system here in Europe, and one that will emerge in Russia. There'll be an advisory committee which will be responsible for planning missions, how to organize the missions that we need to send out to defend ourselves in case when there is a threat emerging. There'll be a third committee responsible for coordinating the work among nations on the emergency issues that might arise in terms of, I mean, the crisis that this could provoke, just like we do with space, tremblement de terre, earthquakes, things like that. Now the question that all of this is going to be submitted at the Committee for the Use of Outer Space of United Nations this month of June. It will probably be adopted, and then it will be submitted in a kind of overall resolution at the United Nations in September, and these committees will pretty much be formed within a year. Now the question that came among us was how should we welcome these developments, the issues having to do with the United Nations and the respect of national sovereignty. How much do we want to push that? The other issue is, would it be a diversion from the necessity of bilateral work between the United States and Russia? So I wanted to see how you would suggest that we report all that.
There's a collection of questions which are really involved in this one question. They involve a certain number of suppositions, particularly political suppositions. Now, you're not going to get the British Empire or anything tied to it is not going to do anything serious in terms of effect on the question of the world economy. You will actually probably destroy the British if you successfully make the corrections in the world economy which have been perpetrated recently. Because this tradition, which we treat as a current problem, and the space program is no different than the rest of the whole process beforehand in this respect. As long as you have a certain conception about money, man, so forth, of the type that we've seen, which is responsible for all of the evils of this type, we have to realize that there is no simple proposal that's going to work, not voluntarily. Well, some people here today have spoken, some who represent credible spokesmen for nations and groups of nations. If we talk together about, on a practical basis, about these problems, we can probably, as I saw today demonstrated in today's session, in particular earlier, things were proposed on the part of Japan and on China and so forth, and similar kinds of things. These things were all, in terms of fact, correct. The question is, how do we put it together? I don't think it would be that difficult for some of us to agree, some nations to agree, or some people in some nations to agree. I could agree to many of these things, for example, the question of China. China is actually given an opportunity which has a death note in it. If you take the population of China and simply reduce their wages and their wage levels to points at which the United States could not possibly produce these kinds of objects, and you're really making slaves out of them. And the question is, what is the effect on China of such a policy? And China has a perfectly plausible policy to work on. We have, in the Pacific area, apart from the fact that it's important that China have an employment program based on technological progress and scientific progress among the Chinese population. If you don't do that, then the advantage of the jobs which are provided by the United States and elsewhere for China and from European nations are not going to do any good to China. Because you've got to think about the future generations of China. You've got to say, well, what about this railway track, which used to exist in China? It crossed over with the area of Jane to it and goes up into Russia. And that chain has never been put back together again. It's stupid. So there are practical questions where people do have to come to agreement on principles. But to try to get an unprincipled agreement has always been a piece of folly. And what I heard this afternoon earlier, and some of the questions on this thing were absolutely correct as far as to my knowledge. Absolutely correct. They correspond, at least in effect, to what are the proper intentions. But the question is, how do we get that put across? We have to do a certain amount of planning. We actually have to do what was indicated today. We have to realize that China is having an economic basis, or what seems an economic basis, which is actually a death trap. If you are not developing the creative powers of the labor force in China, you are creating a death trap for China. China must have access to technological progress, and my view is that the space program is an involvement of China in the space program and a space program of industries. We need a high technology frontier for the Chinese population. Otherwise, the Chinese population is going to be destroyed by the very thing that some people think is benefit today. The same thing is true in whole areas. We have a whole area, the Arctic region. The Arctic region is an area of development. It's closely related to space development. We have a mountain of resources, of mineral resources, in Siberia. These things are valuable. This is the industry, the future of Japan. It's therefore also the future of other countries in that region. It's the interest of these nations. What we have to do is understand, what does mankind require? Not a Mr. or Mrs. Fix-It thing, but what kind of changes in the policies which have destroyed mankind so far, including thermonuclear war, which is now coming on, and is a reality which can strike within a very short period of time. And these economic changes that we would propose, and the exploration of space, put together become factors which you can counterpose worldwide thermonuclear war. And you do it by inspiring the people to see a future, meaningful future of their lives, which means the meaningful future of their children and grandchildren. Because without the motive of service to one's children and grandchildren, as well as one's ancestors, there is no solution for this problem. So we need agreements of these, in spirit, but we also need practical agreements. In terms of I know immediately what I would do with the international monetary system. I would destroy it in its present form, because the whole thing is a fraud. You can't talk about the injustices of a system where the system is a fraud. You cannot talk about we're going to explore space without understanding what the space program is. and why you should do it. You've got to take into account the fact that mankind is living under death threats from within the solar system, even nearby parts of the solar system. And as some of us on the Russian side and in the United States are very much concerned about the policy of SDI, which I was involved in some decades ago. And now it's called also SDE, which is the better name for it, the Strategic Defense of Earth, because we have to defend the planet Earth as a place on which to live. And if you're not thinking about defending Earth in those terms, your efforts don't mean too much. If you're not going to do something about the threats to humanity from asteroids and comets and whatnot, what are you defending? Which means that you have to have a science driver program. You have to build a program of people who are developed to a very much higher level of skill and scientific skill than they are today, commitment to policies based on those skills, and saying we are going to mobilize as if for war against these kinds of enemies, not just human enemies, but enemies which we have to do something about in nearby space and beyond. We never have the full answer. So instead of looking for answers which solve the problem, you've got to commit yourself to the search for the realization of step-by-step progress into the kind of changes. As I would say in China, I'm concerned about China. And it's a concern which involves the entire Pacific region as well. China is the largest population nation of the planet. And it is actually not being given the opportunities which it needs. And the opportunities mean the employment at decent wages for pay, and high-tech training and high-tech technology. I want to see China engaged in space technology, because the space technology and the things related to it are the things that will produce out of that process the employment and training of skilled people of China who can be involved in the space program. We need a high technology program, not merely for space, but in order to increase the technological capabilities of the population. We want skilled engineers. We want skilled, and we want industries which correspond to those high degrees of skills. And if we take that kind of attitude and build ourselves around those kinds of attitudes and kill the monetarist system, just kill it. We don't need the money system. Kill it. It's a fraud. We can build a very good system of government by agreements among governments if we want to do it. But I don't think there are any simple answers. The answer lies, as I said before, I'm a man of the future. I believe that the individual person in society should be capable, through scientific and related training, of seeing the future, not saying, this is as far as I know. You have to take the other step and come to know things that no man could know, you think. And you find all the greatest discoverers are of that disposition. All the greatest musicians, all the greatest playwrights, all the greatest scientists, all the greatest leaders, even military leaders, have operated always on knowing, assuredly, the unknown, to know the future before it happens. That's the essential requirement of leadership, to know the future before it has happened and prepare to act accordingly.